warm welcome to BBC News, broadcasting to our viewers in North America and around the globe. My name is Mike Hembley. Our top stories. 39 people are now known to have died in the bridge collapse in Italy. Hopes are fading of finding any more alive. Some have a lucky escape.
People were running, screaming in Italian, run,
Everyone out, cars, out, cars.
So we just literally, kids run, because we didn't know what was happening.
He's been an outspoken critic of the White House. Now President Trump strips security clearance from former CIA Director John Brennan. What is the story behind the killing of the half-brother of North Korea's leader? 2 women charged with the murder. We'll find out very soon if their trial will go on. The pilot whale stuck in an Icelandic fjord twice in 2 days. No one is quite sure why. And a new era in Tinseltown, Crazy Rich Asians, the first Hollywood movie in a generation to be led by an all-Asian cast. Hello, rescuers are spending a second night searching the rubble of a collapsed motorway bridge in Genoa. But hopes of finding more survivors are all but gone. At least 39 people were killed when it plummeted to the ground on Monday morning. In response to widespread public alarm about more possible failures in the region's infrastructure, a 12-month state of emergency has been declared in Liguria. James Reynolds sent this from Genoa.
Can there be anyone left underneath all this? To find out, rescuers will have to search under every broken concrete slab. But signs of life from beneath the rubble have now died away.
We haven't heard any cries since yesterday afternoon, but we may still find survivors.
Looking up, you can see that some vehicles have been abandoned right on the edges of the section which is still standing just ahead of the collapse. A few more seconds and those drivers would have crashed to the ground. They were all incredibly lucky to survive. Nicola and Lisa Henton-Mitchell from Oxfordshire were here on holiday with their 2 kids. They told me they were driving towards the bridge when they saw a commotion up ahead.
People started shouting, waving their arms to reverse out the windows and
tooting horns and everything like that. And so we tried to reverse and we couldn't go anywhere. And the car in front hit the front of our car. And then people were running, screaming in Italian, run,
Everyone out, cars, out, cars.
So we just literally, kids run, because we didn't know what was happening. We made our son just run, and we sort of grabbed our daughter's hand and started running, but we couldn't pick her up because all the car doors were flying open, people everywhere, torrential rain was coming down.
Screaming, and our daughter took her shoes off because she was just going to sleep before.
She hasn't got her glasses. We left everything in the car and we just ran for our lives.
They took shelter in a motorway tunnel and waited for help. Many other drivers ahead of them lost their lives. The victims include Roberto Robbiano, his wife Ercilia, and their 7-year-old son Samuel. Andrea Cerulli was 48. He had a young son. He was killed on his way to work. 35-year-old father of 4, Luigi Matti Altadonna, was driving his work van. Matteo Bentornati, Giovanni Battiloro, Gerardo Esposito and Antonio Stanzione were all in their 20s and on their way to Spain. They'd originally planned to fly, but they ended up hiring a car instead. The country's Prime Minister, Giuseppe Conte, in just his 3rd month as Italy's leader, promises immediate steps.
These are unacceptable tragedies that should not happen in a modern society. This government will do everything to prevent such tragedies from happening again.
But this has been promised before. Yet for years, successive governments failed to fix Italy's crumbling infrastructure. Many Italians will ask why this new administration should be any different.
James Reynolds there. The company responsible for maintenance at the site has been defending its record. It insists the bridge has been checked every 3 months. James gave us more of the latest details from the scene.
The Public Prosecutor's Office here in Genoa will begin a criminal investigation. The Prime Minister says he wants anyone responsible to be held to account. Mr. Conte now has access to special funds which will allow him to try to make this area safe. But beyond all that, Italy faces wider questions. How has this country perpetuated over so many years a culture which has allowed its infrastructure to degrade? Italy spends less money on its bridges and roads than other similarly sized European countries, and even when it does spend that money, it's often wasted on corruption or mismanagement. One engineer said about this bridge when it was standing that it was more expensive to maintain it than it would have been simply to knock it down and start all over again. So Italy may have to consider trying to change the way its country works.
Let's bring you more now of the day's other news. At least 48 people have been killed in a suicide attack against an education centre in a mainly Shia area of the Afghan capital. Many of those killed are believed to be teenagers who were getting extra tuition as they prepared for university entrance. More than 60 people were wounded. The Taliban have denied any involvement. Police in London have been given more time to question the man arrested after a car crashed into a barrier outside Parliament. Salih Khater is a British citizen originally from Sudan. He's been questioned by counter-terrorism officers, though the BBC understands they have not formally declared what happened at Westminster a terrorist incident. The imprisoned former president of Brazil, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, has been registered as a candidate for the presidential elections in October, even though he's in prison, convicted of corruption. Thousands of his supporters gathered outside the Supreme Electoral Court in Brasilia to show their support. Lula is expected to be barred from running. Brazilian law bans people with convictions from running for office. The United States has condemned Turkey's decision to increase import duties on a number of American products. They include rice, cars and coal. The White House says it's a step in the wrong direction. The two countries are in dispute about an American pastor under house arrest in Izmir. The White House has broken with tradition and stripped the security clearance from a former CIA director. John Brennan has been highly critical of President Trump on Twitter and elsewhere. In response, he tweeted the president's actions should gravely worry all Americans, including intelligence professionals, about the cost of speaking out. He said, "My principles are worth far more than clearances. I will not relent." He continued, historically, officials who've served in office do often keep their access to weigh in on security matters and speak with their replacements. Speaking on behalf of the president, the White House press secretary named a number of other officials she says could also have clearance withdrawn.
As part of this review, I am evaluating action with respect to the following individuals: James Clapper, James Comey, Michael Hayden, Sally Yates, Susan Rice, Andrew McCabe, Peter Strzok, Lisa Page, and Bruce Orr. Security clearances for those who still have them may be revoked, and those who have already lost their security clearance may not be able to have it reinstated.
Sarah Sanders there in the White House. Let's get more from our North America correspondent, Peter Bowes. Peter, that will sound to a lot of people like a whole list of threats. What's been the response to all this?
Well, there has been, in some quarters, a very angry response to this. John Kerry, for example, the former Secretary of State in the last administration, said Mr. Trump was behaving like the ruler of a banana republic. And of course, Mr. Brennan himself sending out a tweet very quickly after hearing this news with his own views, suggesting that Donald Trump is trying to stifle free speech. He says the move is part of President Trump's broader efforts to suppress freedom of speech and punish critics. He goes on, he says it should gravely worry all Americans, including intelligence professionals, about the cost of speaking out. My principles, he says, are worth far more than clearances. I will not relent. And it is true that he has been a strong critic of the president, describing him as treasonous after his meeting with President Putin, and as we've just heard, there are other names on the list. This may not be the end of the matter. James Comey, for example, who has described the president as morally unfit to lead. He is one of the president's harshest critics, a former director of the FBI. He could potentially lose his clearance as well. Others have suggested that this could all be about the president's attempt to change the national conversation, or at least change the conversation on cable news in the States, which has been dominated in recent months by the Russia investigation. And over the next couple of days, we will have probably the conclusion of the trial of Paul Manafort, Donald Trump's former campaign manager, who's facing financial fraud charges, not directly linked to the Trump campaign, but clearly he worked with him during that period in 2016. And that verdict could come in, could create more negative headlines for the president by the end of the week.
Indeed, and we'll keep a close eye on that, of course. Thank you very much, Peter. The judge in the trial of two women charged with killing the half-brother of North Korea's leader is expected to rule on Thursday whether to proceed with the case. Indonesian national Siti Aisyah and Doan Thi Huong, who's from Vietnam, are accused of smearing the lethal nerve agent VX over Kim Jong-nam's face at Kuala Lumpur International Airport last year. They say they believe they are playing roles in a prank TV show.
This is really the pivotal moment in this quite extraordinary trial, which is after hearing 6 months of evidence from the prosecution, more than 30 witnesses, more than 200 pieces of evidence. The judge has to decide at this stage whether there is actually a case against the two women. The prosecution have argued that the two women were culpable in what they describe as a professional assassination plot. Now, they've also charged 4 North Korean men who fled the country on the day that Kim Jong-nam was killed in February last year. But very little's been said about North Korea's involvement during this trial. The prosecution have focused purely on these 2 rather poor women who got caught up in this and have tried to argue that they were, in their own words, professional assassins who are responsible for the death of Kim Jong-nam. The defence have argued all along that the 2 women were essentially sucked into an elaborate plan by North Korean officials where they believed they were carrying out essentially pranks. They've pointed out lots of practice beforehand, payments made to the women who were recruited in entertainment places here in Kuala Lumpur. They also pointed out that the failure of the police and the government to pursue the North Koreans, who they say are the masterminds, leaves this case very, very weak. The judge must now decide whether to accept the case, push it forward, in which case we will, for the first time in future trials, hear from the 2 women themselves and from many other witnesses. They face execution by hanging if they're found guilty of culpable murder, or the judge could dismiss the case. That in itself would be extraordinary. It would mean there would be nobody at all being held accountable for this quite bizarre crime. Or it's possible he may decide to downgrade the charge and say, well, they weren't responsible for murder, they didn't know what they were doing, but perhaps they have some responsibility for his death. That verdict will come through in the next few hours, and after that we will know how Malaysia is going to pursue this case. All the way through this, Malaysia has downgraded relations with North Korea, but it hasn't severed them. It's quite clear a political decision has been made by the previous government. It's been continued by this government to try to maintain ties and even restore them with North Korea. There seems to be no real will in the Malaysian establishment to pursue North Korea's role in this, even though everything we've seen so far suggests this was indeed a North Korean plot and that these 2 women had, at best, a fairly minor role in it.
Jonathan Head for us there. Much more to come for you on BBC News, including this. A push for more affordable homes. New Zealand's Parliament bans almost all foreigners from buying existing houses. We speak to the government minister who made the announcement.
The big crowds became bigger as the time of the funeral approached. As the lines of fans became longer, the police prepared for a huge job of crowd control.
Idi Amin, Uganda's brutal former dictator, has died at the age of 80. He's been buried in Saudi Arabia, where he lived in exile since being overthrown in 1979.
2 billion people around the world have seen the last total eclipse of the sun to take place in this millennium. It began its journey off the coast of Canada, ending 3 hours later when the sun set over the Bay of Bengal.
Very good to have you with us on BBC News. The latest headlines for you. Italy has declared a state of emergency in the region around Genoa after that bridge collapse that killed at least 39 people. Many others were lucky to escape. President Trump has stripped security clearance from the former CIA director John Brennan, who's been an outspoken critic of the White House. He says he will not stop. Now, New Zealand's parliament has banned many foreigners from buying existing homes in the country, a move aimed at making properties more affordable. Low interest rates, limited housing stock and immigration have been blamed for driving up prices in recent years. Well, New Zealand's Associate Finance Minister David Parker announced that new ban, and we can go live to him right now in New Zealand's capital, Wellington. Welcome, very good to talk to you. Thank you for your time. You will have heard the squeals from around the world. All of us who are relying on New Zealand as our bolt hole from the apocalypse. You've just abandoned us, haven't you?
Well, it's not really about that. You're welcome to come. We've got very good immigration policy in New Zealand, and anyone who arrives can immediately buy a house. But we do think that the housing market should be for those who've got the right to live here permanently, and that it should be shaped by New Zealand price pressures, not international demand.
Well, I'm lucky enough to have a New Zealand passport. My mum was a Kiwi, but that's beside the point, really. So what you've done essentially is reclassify all residential land as sensitive land. I know Jacinda Ardern campaigned on this. Part of the point is to bring down homelessness and property prices generally, isn't it?
It's part of it. We have a view that our most beautiful bays in the Bay of Islands or lakeside properties should be within the reach of our most successful New Zealanders, and that it goes all the way down the income spectrum to the most modest home, which is nonetheless someone's dream. We've got the lowest rate of home ownership in New Zealand since the 1950s, and we're addressing that in a number of ways, both on the demand side with measures like this, but also on the supply side with a big government house building program.
I'm sure you know the figures. I was just looking at them. I can see the foreign investment percentage, say, in Auckland, very popular, that's 20%, in Queenstown, 10%, but the overall level of foreign home buying, relatively low, isn't it, nationwide?
Well, it's probably come off where it was a couple of years ago when the property market was running really hot and there were fewer controls on outward capital flows in some of the countries from which some of the buying pressure was coming. But if you take Queenstown, about 10% of the properties across a whole district being purchased by overseas people, there can be absolutely no doubt that that is having an effect on the marginal price. There's a question as to how big the price effect is, but there is no doubt it has an effect. One of the effects of changing this will be that the construction capacity that we have, both from New Zealand investment and foreign direct investment, which we still allow into new housing, will be directed more to the needs of New Zealanders rather than the high-end buyers who would otherwise be diverting some of that construction effort.
Are you not worried that it will discourage foreign investment in other areas?
No, we've been pretty explicit about that. We have high rates of foreign direct investment in much of our economy, and indeed in the same piece of legislation that's introducing the ban on buying existing homes, we're loosening the foreign investment rules in respect of forestry. So, those investors will make those decisions based on the profitability of those investments, not on the basis of other investments that they can't make.
Minister, very good to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, floods and landslides in southern India have killed at least 43 people. It's the worst flooding in almost a century. Hundreds of villages are submerged. Landslides have caused road and rail chaos. One of the main international airports, Kochi, in the state of Kerala, has been closed because water entered airport buildings. Heavy monsoons are expected to continue throughout the week. A Libyan court has sentenced 45 militiamen to death for killing dozens of demonstrators in Tripoli during the uprising that overthrew Colonel Gaddafi. The case relates to events in August 2011 when rebels were closing in on the capital. Pro-regime militia opened fire on protesters in the Abu Slim district, killing dozens. More than 50 other defendants in the case have been given 5-year jail terms. The BBC has said it will not appeal against losing a High Court case about its coverage of a police raid on Sir Cliff Richard's home in 2014. Last month, the judge ruled the corporation infringed the singer's privacy in broadcasting a police search of his property in Berkshire. He was never arrested or charged during the inquiry by South Yorkshire Police into an historical child sex allegation. BBC says it believes the ruling would limit the ability of journalists to report on police investigations. It will ask the British government to consider a review of the privacy law. Now, a whale of a tale, you could say. Around 100 of them got stuck in a fjord in Iceland this weekend. Police helped them get out. It was in the west of the country, but less than 24 hours later, they were back again and needed more help to get out once more. Lebu Diseko has the story.
This is a rescue operation in action. The second in as many days for this pod of around 100 whales. They got stuck after swimming into a fjord. Its opening is both narrow and shallow, making it hard to get out. Police helped guide them into more open waters, and it was hoped they'd go back to sea. But the next day, they were back once again. Cue rescue effort number 2.
13 of them went all the way to the shore, and we had to deal with them, push them out by hand, and that went very well.
One of the whales even got stuck up on the shore and needed a kayaker to help get free. It's not clear why the group keep going back, but locals say they may be using the incoming tide to help them. And they've certainly attracted quite an audience.
Naturally, this is interesting to see for both foreigners and Icelanders, to view and experience this in nature. You can't see this in an aquarium. This is pure nature, which makes it more interesting.
The group was eventually guided even further out in the hope that they'd find their way to the ocean. That seems to have done the trick, but if they do return, rescue teams will be on hand once again to help them find their way. Lebu Diseko, BBC News.
The hotly anticipated movie Crazy Rich Asians has just been released across the United States. It is a significant milestone for Hollywood because it is the first studio film set in the present day to be led by an all-Asian cast in 25 years. If it's a success, it could bring a rush of other Hollywood films with Asian casts, as Tom Brooke reports from New York.
What about us taking an adventure east?
Like Queens?
Singapore.
Crazy Rich Asians, inspired by a bestseller, tells the story of Rachel, a Chinese-American professor in New York who travels with her Oxford-educated boyfriend to meet his family in Singapore, where he was born. There she discovers to her amazement that he's Singapore's most eligible bachelor and heir to a fortune. This romantic comedy chronicles her immersion into a world of extreme affluence and her tense relationship with her boyfriend's mother.
She just thinks you're some, like, unrefined banana.
No. Those are a few fingers.
Yellow on the outside, white on the inside.
Asian Americans who've been to advanced screenings of the film in New York have been responding enthusiastically, viewing it as validating.
I've lived here almost my entire life, although I was born in China, and I've never seen a film that has an Asian cast and has them portrayed in such diverse ways and so glamorously.
Crazy Rich Asians stands in stark contrast to most Hollywood films where there's a dearth of Asian stories and characters. One survey has found among top recent Hollywood films, Asians represented less than around 1 in 20 of all speaking characters.
Don't you want Nick to be happy?
I know you're not what Nick needs.
And often the Asian characters that do appear on screen reinforce negative stereotypes. Crazy Rich Asians tries to deliver more rounded, authentic depictions of Asian men and women.
Ever since I can remember, my family has been my whole life. Rachel.
Crazy Rich Asians has been the target of some protest. There were complaints that the leading man, who has a white British father and Malaysian mother, wasn't Asian enough for this Asian-led film. There's also been some complaint over the representation of Singapore in the film, that the local Malay and Indian populations have been ignored.
For the criticism where it comes to there's not a lot of sort of brown figures or actors or people from Malaysia or India in the film, absolutely, there isn't enough. There should be more of these films to be able to represent everybody. But again, this is a step in the right direction.
Clearly, there's a lot riding on Crazy Rich Asians. Its performance at the box office is going to be closely watched.
its success at the box office will sort of pave the way or open doors for other films that are sort of waiting in queue to be green-lighted from production companies to be distributed, to be funded.
Rachel, these people aren't just rich, okay? They're crazy rich.
The release of Crazy Rich Asians has been described as a watershed moment for Asian representation. Right now, the portents look good. The film has been getting strong media exposure, and it's been earning some very positive reviews. Tom Brooke, BBC News, New York.
Loads of fun. This possibly not so much fun. A mysterious Russian satellite is raising alarm in the US. The State Department transcript says we don't know for certain what it is and there is no way to verify it, raising concern that it could be a weapon. A senior Russian diplomat called those accusations unfounded and slanderous. Just briefly, a reminder of that top story. Again, Italy has declared a 12-month state of emergency in the Liguria region around the bridge in Genoa that collapsed, killing at least 39 people. The Prime Minister, Giuseppe Conte, said the Cabinet has also allocated nearly $6 million from central emergency funds to deal with immediate problems. The viaduct carried one of northern Italy's main highways. The government's threatened to strip Autostrada per l'Italia of its contract to maintain the road, but the company says it is confident it can prove it met its obligations. You're watching BBC News. Much more for you on all the main news anytime on the BBC website, and you can reach me and most of the team on Twitter. I'm at BBC Mike Embley. That's it for now. Thanks for watching.
You're watching PBS.